We're really, really, really pleased and honored to have Bruce Lourie joining us today to deliver our second keynote, Understanding Big Change and the Role of Messengers in Environmental Campaigns. And just on a personal note, I met Bruce for the first time in spring of 2022 when he was heading out to Vancouver for a Globe meeting and proposed that we meet. And we sat after that meeting with all the decision makers and CEOs of different organizations. We sat outside in the sunshine at a cafe for 2 hours talking about CAPE and what the Ivey Foundation does and how we could work together, which led to an incredible amount of funding, generous funding flowing from the Ivey Foundation to CAPE. And for that, we are incredibly grateful. And it's what's leading to some of the impact, a lot of the impact that we're generating today. So in terms of this bio that I have here in front of me, Dr. Bruce Lourie is one of Canada's leading climate and sustainability experts known for rethinking complex challenges and creating solutions that advance both the economy and the environment. He's helped establish more than a dozen influential organizations supporting Canada's net zero transition, including the Canadian Climate Institute, Institute for Sustainable Finance, and Efficiency Canada. At the Ivey Foundation, Bruce leads the Economy and Environment program and engages widely across sectors to advance a competitive net zero future. A highly sought after speaker and media commentator, he received the Order of Canada in 2024 and is co-author of the best-selling Slow Death by Rubber Duck. And by the way, Bruce, before I even knew who you were, my brother-in-law was actually telling me about your book, Slow Death by Rubber Duck. So you are everywhere, and we're so pleased that you're joining us today. Thanks.
Oh, my pleasure, Melissa. And I remember our coffee in the sun in Vancouver very well. And as I'm sure you know too, I have not a significant history, but a long history with CAPE. Way back when. I'm going to say it was probably around even you guys might know 95 or 96 or so. When I was working as a consultant, part of my work was running the Laidlaw Foundation's program, and I designed a program that focused on children's health and the environment. And it was through that program that we made a grant to help the burgeoning CAPE create their first ever business plan, working with, I think it was Kapil Kader and Warren Bell. If any of you know them, if they're still around. Anyway, CAPE has been one of my favorite organizations over the years. I think it's such an outstanding group, and I just want to thank all of you for all of the work that you do. It's so important to our country. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to try to share just a couple things here. So what I'm going to do, and I hope this isn't too controversial, but it's where's my stupid presentation? Here it is. Oh, for Pete's sakes, content only, share. Okay. And how does that look?
Great.
Excellent. So, as Melissa noted, I've been working on environmental issues for my entire career, which is now rather long in the tooth, and I'm actually working on another book, and as part of that book, I've tried to summarize a lot of my thinking on where we've gone right and where we've gone wrong on environmental work, and and this is just one element. I've come up with sort of 7 elements that make for successful environmental change projects, big environmental change projects. And this really focuses primarily on 1 or 2 of them. And so the questions that I'm not going to answer them all right now, but just to get you thinking as I'm speaking. So, you know, when we think about campaigns and we think about any kind of social change, activism, you know, I think there's a question around, you know, who has the right to speak, and related to that, who wants to listen to you, quite frankly. And And when it comes to environmental issues, it really matters who delivers the message. In some cases, the voices are as important as the message itself. And so, one of the questions is for you to think about. Do you have the right to speak on which issues, and how do you protect your credibility as you're speaking? A second one is for you to think about, what do you actually see as physicians in your practices, emergency rooms, clinics? What patterns are you noticing? Are there health trends that only you can document because you're the ones in the examination room or at the front lines of the health sector? Another question, where does your expertise begin and end? How do you distinguish between professional medical advocacy and general environmental activism? And I guess from your perspective, what's the difference and does it matter? I'm going to touch on what makes physician advocacy succeed. Are there things that, are there things that we can learn from specifically if we look at, tobacco, lead, asbestos, major health issues that have took a lot of years, but health professionals were critical to their success. And this one that I think we're all constantly thinking of and working on is, how is climate change a health problem, and how do we think about climate change through a health lens, and what does that mean in terms of what you do and how you speak about climate change? And then finally, what's the most powerful thing you can do? And so essentially, what approach would have the greatest impact while staying true to your role as physicians? And I'm going to stop sharing there for a minute, and then just sort of ponder those things. First of all, I think it's critical, and this is really what appealed to me at the very outset when I was way back when, 30 years ago, working on these things, was a recognition that even back then, we were having difficulty making progress on certain environmental issues. And part of the reason, in my conclusion, was that basically the public wasn't listening to, and actually it's a little bit more recent than that, maybe some of this analysis, but the public starts tuning out of issues that seem either too complex, or there's a framework that we use that's actually, I think you would find interesting. It's basically a grid quadrant of issues, and whether those issues are perceived by the public, which is different than whether they truly are, but perceived by the public to be either urgent or solvable. And if you imagine that quadrant with the four different quadrants, so the matrix with four quadrants, on the lower left, if your issue is stuck in there, which would be an issue that is neither perceived to be urgent nor solvable, basically the public tunes out and politicians don't think there's anything they can do. And climate change was kind of there for quite a long time. It wasn't seen to be really urgent. And part of the problem, frankly, I think a lot of the messages were, well, we need to do something about your grandchildren. Well, people are worrying about, food on the table and paying a mortgage and their older parents in homes. They're not really thinking about their grandchildren that much, unless, maybe the small number of people that are dealing with their grandchildren. So for a lot of years, we pushed the idea of climate change as something that's happening too far in the future to make it feel urgent. And frankly, I mean, it's much easier to make the case now, but 20 years ago, the models showed what was going to happen. Remarkably, I remember I was very active back then. The climate models have been incredibly accurate, and if anything, what we've seen is an increasing effects of climate change that are greater than what the models predicted. But it's all very accurate. But we didn't really see the evidence as much. So 20, 30 years ago, things weren't that urgent, and certainly they didn't seem solvable. And it's really only quite recently, I think, that climate change is seen to be solvable. And in fact, the working title of my book is Solved because I think we've solved climate change technologically. It's very straightforward. We simply need to replace fossil fuel with electricity. I mean, that's the solution for the vast majority of climate change. But I'm not. That's another talk I do. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail on that, although I'd happily talk about it with if there's questions. Anyway, so technically we know what to do. Also, I think we have a challenge living in Canada, in North America, quite frankly, where we are now dropping so far behind the rest of the world in understanding and implementing the solutions. And I really do worry that our country is just so out of step with Asia and Europe and Scandinavia. Even extraordinary statistics in countries like Pakistan in terms of installation of solar panels. So we're a bit problematic. We're more as a large oil exporter. We look more like large oil exporters, and the other large oil exporters are Saudi Arabia, Russia, countries like UAE and Qatar, or large oil producers like the United States, which is still the largest oil producing country in the world, and also the largest LNG export country in the world. So the U.S., sometimes talks a good game, but they are still the world's largest oil producer. So we're stuck in this North American environment where the politics and the economics of fossil fuel are really more challenging. But anyway, I don't want to get into that either. So what do I want to get into? I want to talk about what is your role as physicians in helping us think this through. And I think fundamentally, one of the things, and this line that I'm about to use, which is something that dawned on me again way back when I was working as a consultant, and through that role, I helped coordinate and initiate the Ontario coal phase out, which to this day is, I think, still the largest climate action in Canada, and at the time it was the largest climate action in North America. But what the line that I used with the Laidlaw Foundation board way back then was that the success that we were seeing is because the messenger is the message. So I'm taking that from the famous Marshall McLuhan line around the media is the message. And the idea of the messenger is the message is that for, I think, certainly the first time I'd seen, and I think still to this day, one of the more successful examples of this was we basically came up with the idea that, it was the recognition in the research that we had done that coal plants were contributing to all sorts of things environmentally. They were one of the largest sources of many toxic chemicals. They were, for example, one of the largest sources of mercury in the environment. I did a lot of research on mercury pollution. They were one of the largest contributors to climate change, largest contributors to smog and urban air quality, largest contributor to acid rain. So coal plants were really a problem. And so my conclusion back then with the groups that I was working with was, why are we talking about all these environmental issues when really we need to go after coal and we need to figure out how to replace coal? And so we came up with the campaign to phase out coal, which at the time, people thought it was sort of a crazy idea because this was at about 1995, 1996. And, but we set about to do the campaign, and we did a lot of research really looking at what the alternatives were to coal. So we had to make coal both, as I said, seen to getting rid of coal as both urgent, but also solvable. And the solvability piece was really looking at how in Ontario could we phase out coal without ruining the economy, doing all other things. And it's not, the solutions, aren't perfect, but basically we ended up getting the most ambitious renewable energy program in Canada at the time, one of the most ambitious in North America. We had some nuclear power plant refurbishments at the time, which helped out, and Ontario built some combined cycle gas powered power plants as well that helped out. And emissions dropped dramatically. And after years and years of having 20, 30, 50, 60 days of air quality advisories, the first year after the last coal plant shut down, there were no air quality advisories in Southern Ontario, like literally for decades. So we saw the success. But the critical piece in that campaign was engaging doctors. And specifically at the time, it was the Ontario Medical Association. And so we basically turned the campaign from an environmental campaign, and quite frankly, climate change was barely even discussed back then. It was a combination of sort of air quality, like whatever terminology you want to use, air quality, air pollution, smog, particulates, all of that in Southern Ontario. Which was having a direct, immediate, and measurable health effect on the population, and therefore we basically made it into this combined air quality and health campaign. And the OMA was remarkable to work with. One of the things we did at the Ivey Foundation was actually create the first ever position of an environment director at the Ontario Medical Association. And there was a doctor back then, Dr. Ted Bodway, who was just an extraordinary communicator and really drove the campaign. So why did doctors, and this was the kind of thing too, where people have been talking about, all of these other environmental issues, like the environmental groups were, but there wasn't really much traction. And so what shifted? And getting back to, the messenger is the message. The story basically became one where it was the fact that doctors were saying that coal plants were a problem, or doctors were saying more specifically that poor air quality in Southern Ontario was a problem. That in and of itself became the message in the media. The fact that it was now these, of course, the credibility of your profession. So you're among the most trusted professionals in the country or in the world. Your expertise is grounded in evidence-based science. You see the human cost of environmental degradation every day in your work. You have no financial stake in the energy or environmental policy debates. And frankly, you aren't seen as lefty activists, although I know deep down many of you are because I've met you. But the reality is that once you started to get doctors talking about healthcare, it just shifted the debate unbelievably in Ontario, and to the point where the other thing that people miss is, as you would all know, the medical associations are the fee negotiating bodies with provincial governments. So they had a particular political clout in the system and access in the system. So it was very interesting just to see how the debate changed. So one of my messages for you is to really recognize the trust that you have, and the fact that trust is precious. It takes generations to build. It took years of personal sacrifice and commitment for each of you, and it's important, I think, that you quite frankly recognize how speaking to what you know and speaking powerfully about it is really what makes big change happen. And so I'm going to touch on a few things in terms of where I see particular opportunities for you. But just before I get into that, so when you think about that, my main message is that the fact that you are physicians is what gives you a powerful voice, not that you are environmental activist physicians. The fact that you're environmental activists is awesome, but you want to use your position as doctors basically to be effective environmental activists. So what this means is, and this is something that I apply, across the board at the work that we do at the Ivey Foundation. So we created something called Farmers for Climate Solutions, and that's to get farmers talking about climate change. Obviously, we created something called the Institute for Sustainable Finance, which is getting business school and finance professors to start talking about it. We work with another fantastic group that I'm sure you know, also in BC, called the Canadian Climate Law Initiative, which is getting lawyers to talk about climate change and climate risk. And so we've basically created this ecosystem of organizations that bring professionals that understand what they do to effectively be, environmental voices. And I think we're seeing the benefits of that in many cases. It's still, of course, still a tough slog. So my message is really that you should be speaking with authority about the things that you know and the things that you see directly. And very specifically, this would mean, I use the example of air pollution. But in the case of climate change, for example, wildfire smoke, I mean, clearly that was just such an obvious health challenge for people in Canada and across, North America and the world. I mean, that is, I would say, one of the top opportunities for you as physicians to really engage on these issues. Another one is extreme heat and heat domes. And I'll go into some of the details on that. But what it means is, you shouldn't be weighing in on whether we build pipelines or not. You shouldn't be weighing in on whether we have a carbon tax or not, or you shouldn't be weighing in on renewable energy subsidies. You don't have to talk about those things because you're not engineers or economists or energy sector experts. You're doctors. So I think the things, as I imagine it, if you're on, and I know that you are doing this. But the more that you are in the press or talking to your local MPs or MPPs or MLAs about these things and saying, I am seeing more people in my office with respiratory problems, or I am seeing more kids with asthma, or that kind of a message, I think is really, really, really critical. Or, the emergency room was overwhelmed during the last heat dome. And then you can tie that to, we've got to get a grip in this country about what we're doing about climate change. So, so the message is really kind of, stick to your knitting, because your knitting is hugely powerful. So I'm just going to touch, and someone please send me a message if I'm going on too long here, but I think I've got some more time and I'd love to take some questions from you. So let's just look at a few of the things, and I already talked about air pollution and particulate matter, so I won't really talk about that too much more, but it is still something, and we've supported polling work for years and years and years and years. And if you ask people unprompted, climate's creeping up a little bit, but if you ask people unprompted in Canada, what most concerns them about environmental problems, two things always come up: clean air, clean water. It's like the fundamentals of life. And again, that's, things that you can connect to. Just keep kind of that, like the simple stuff in mind. But I recall back when we were doing the coal campaign and having the OMA do press events, and Ted Bodway honestly was brilliant. And he was kind of ruthless in making sure that they only ever talk about health. In fact, he didn't ever want to be on a stage with an environmental group. We had a little secret group behind the scenes that we called the Clean Air Strategy Group. And that's where we, some of the environmentalists and the doctors and, we all conspired behind the scenes. But publicly, the doctors were only the doctors. And I remember Ted giving these presentations explaining how particulate matter gets into the, penetrates deep into lung tissue and gets in your bloodstream and causes, inflammation and blah, 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 and leads to heart attacks and strokes. And anyways, it was brilliant. It was brilliant. But what was amazing is, the media were just eating up this medical understanding of why this is important. And Ted, absolutely, if you asked him, well, how would you suggest we go about phasing out coal plants? He would say, I don't know, talk to the people that understand coal plants. He was just so disciplined. It was remarkable. So touching on, related to that, of course, is, something like wildfire smoke and, the particulate matter, PM 2.5, that is created by wildfire smoke. I mean, that is, as I said, I think that is going to be one of the biggest ongoing opportunities for you to be effective as physicians working on environmental issues. I suffer from asthma, so I feel it when I'm out in, the last couple of summers and springs. But a real, and again, I know you're doing this. I'm not telling you things you don't know. I'm just trying to reinforce maybe where to put the emphasis. But of course, it really is on the vulnerable population. So elderly, pregnant women, children, who are disproportionately affected. And those messages really carry weight with the public, with the media, and with politicians. And I think I think just really, really going deep on that. Maybe there's research that could be done specifically in Canada that would look at respiratory effects of wildfire smoke exposure. Just in the research that I've done quickly on this, things like increased risk of heart attacks, low birth rates, cognitive impacts in children. I mean, there's no doubt going to be all kinds of new research emerging from what has become such a huge issue globally. Another angle would be looking at northern communities and wildfire smoke affecting northern communities. I think that's something that is obviously critical because of the direct impact, but also useful in that northern communities often get left out. Obviously, Indigenous communities get left out and have more difficulty participating in in some of these conversations. So I think that that's really important. But again, I would just remind you that you're presenting this as a clinical observation, not as climate advocacy. And I think that's, I'm just going to continue to drive that message here. I know part of the work that we've been supporting that I think is really great is looking at, and this is sort of another side of all of it, not so much the health effects of climate change, but the one area where there's an interesting intersection with some of the climate advocacy components and campaigns is the use of natural gas in buildings. And I just think that's such interesting work. And I know, I think, Melissa, I connected you to one of my academic colleagues at McGill, who's doing some of the first research ever done in Canada, measuring the emissions of coming off of natural gas appliances in people's homes. So that, and then just so you know, we're also supporting organizations that are trying to get natural gas bans in communities. So there's this kind of combo of things that I think is really important. We're starting, I think this is going to be a great success. I think we really are going to start to see a replacement of natural gas in homes, in more quickly than we imagine. We also support a group that's focused exclusively on accelerating heat pump adoption in commercial and residential buildings. So anything that you can do to pile on the idea that we shouldn't be we shouldn't basically be exposing ourselves to these appliances in our homes when we have obvious, easy alternatives. Extreme heat and urban heat, heat domes. I think this too is going to be, certainly increasing, especially, Canada's, we're unique in our geographic position being so far north. And again, if you look at the temperature gradients showing increased temperature as you go north. Everyone talks about 1.5 degrees, which clearly we're not going to be there. 2 degrees is still doable at a stretch, but we're already seeing in the Arctic warming of 3.5, 4 degrees, like happening now today. I think I think we're going to. I think that's just going to continue to be a real challenge in this country, and something that I think in terms of looking at, again, vulnerable populations, whether it's outdoor workers, homeless populations, people that can't afford air conditioning. I think really that's going to be something that we're going to see significant increased mortality in Canada. And I'm actually, anyway, I think that's going to be a big one. And then another one, I just had a colleague who, actually, I've got many colleagues and, family friends I live in Toronto area that, have Lyme disease, have ticks on them, have gotten West Nile. I know someone that had West Nile and Lyme. The vector-borne and waterborne disease issue is going to continue to be problematic here. The Lyme disease distribution in Canada has expanded dramatically. Ticks have expanded dramatically. They're living through the summers due to the warmer weather. They've expanded north. They're well up in cottage country. If you can do a combined campaign of cottage owners and doctors, in cottage country in Canada, I think that'll be a good one. And then, of course, we're seeing flooding events all over the world and here in Canada, contaminating water supplies, sewage or agricultural runoff, combined with warmer temperatures that are allowing bacteria to thrive. So this is another huge area that ample opportunity for physicians to weigh in on. And I think, I don't know, Lyme disease is one of those things where my sense is it got way ahead of our understanding, and I think to be tracking the shifts and tracking the actual incidence of Lyme disease is going to be really important. And then one that's become increasingly talked about, and I'm sure, again, I don't, I'm not a medical doctor, so I don't see it directly in my work, but is the whole area of mental health impacts of climate change, and that's everything from eco anxiety, which is seems particularly prevalent among young people. Depression and anxiety related to wildfires, floods, extreme weather events. Farm communities facing drought, losing crops. Dislocation and relocation. It's I think again that's going to be something that we see much more significantly. And I just, as I was looking into it, a study that shows that rates of depression increased from about 3% to over 20% following the fires in Fort McMurray. Just basically, stress and displacement after the massive fire in Fort McMurray. So this, and I guess this brings in the whole field of, psychiatrists and family doctors that are seeing people on the front lines. So those are obvious, I'm sure, to all of you, but just from my perspective, I think provide a huge amount of opportunity for doctors to be actively engaged as advocates on these issues. And just again, I touched on at the very beginning a few things, but the coal phase out campaign in Ontario really was, I think, one of the most successful campaigns of doctors that doctors have led in the country. There's been several case studies done on it now, but I would really look at that and look at those case studies to really see the specific role that that doctors played in that, because it really was so critical. Earlier on, removing lead from gasoline was also something that was a combination of physicians and medical researchers that really defined and understood the issue, but also doctors getting involved, and particularly in the case of lead and in the case of mercury that I was working on for a number of years. It was really pediatric physicians and pediatric medical researchers that were looking at, in this case, the neurotoxicity of heavy metals. And I think that's still, as Melissa mentioned, I wrote with my co-author Rick Smith a book called Slow Death by Rubber Duck, which is really a book on environmental health, and but focused mostly on endocrine disrupting chemicals. But in that, I documented a fair bit of this sort of thinking, and specifically mercury. And it was it's still one of these issues where I think it's just not talked about enough. The role of heavy metals or endocrine disrupting chemicals. It seems to have declined somewhat, at least from my perspective. I was going to talk a little bit about, of course, there's the anti-smoking campaigns that, have been incredibly successful and are great models to look at. And asbestos is another one. I mean, asbestos is still, what I drew from my work on, actually when I was doing my doctoral thesis, I was really looking at heavy metals and the inability of Canada to regulate heavy metals as a case study for effectively the inability of Canada to regulate most things, including climate change and fossil fuels. And what my conclusion was is that, of many conclusions, but one in particular was that that basically the fact that these heavy metals are metals in the same way that oil and fossil fuels are kind of in the mineral world, Canada basically just saw them as critical exports. And what happened, I won't get into all the details, but it basically changes the regulatory pathway inside the federal government, and it basically takes the decision-making out of Environment Canada and sticks it in Natural Resources Canada. And Natural Resources Canada's entire mandate is to extract and export resources, not to restrict resources. So I certainly learned quite a bit on why it is that we have so much difficulty regulating things like gas and oil and coal at a federal level in Canada. But again, this is where I think having doctors, because if you look at our federal legislation, Health Canada, Natural Resources Canada, and Environment Canada all intersect, and having a health message coming through Health Canada in the federal system is very important in terms of moving public policy. So again, doctors should be talking to Health Canada directly on health issues versus, say, Environment Canada. And I'm going to not quite wrap up. I'm getting close to wrapping up here. So in terms of what this means for, and maybe what I'll do is try to find my slides here again. But in terms of what this means, there's sort of do's and don'ts that I've come up with for you, and just I can send some of this around too if it's of interest to people. So I think number one is document health outcomes that you're seeing in your patients directly. track the trends in climate-sensitive diseases. And I don't know if I guess a question for you is whether CAPE has that kind of a research capability to be really looking at pulling together not primary research, but pulling together some summaries of the evidence that's out there. Really important for you to be speaking to your medical societies and speaking to public health agencies as health advocates on these issues. If there's opportunities to provide testimony or speak, I occasionally speak at Senate committees or resource committees, legislative committees in the federal government. Having doctors talk about health effects at those is very powerful. Of course, you would do this anyway, but educating your patients about some of the health risks we talked about, heat, smoke, ticks, things like that. And I guess one area where I can be quite effective, and again, I'm sure you're doing these sorts of things, is advocating for the health protective measures, because we are going to increasingly need to be focusing on adaptation and protection, and so that means cooling centers, having the ability for people to basically just avoid and be protected from the health effects that we're seeing. And again, I think the more that we start seeing case studies published on these using the growing epidemiological data, I think the more this is going to have traction. And just on the don'ts side, I mean, my advice would be, again, really focus on your expertise and credibility and the trust that you have, and avoid being drawn into kind of the traditional environmental campaign world. I don't really think, there's a tendency in a lot of movements to think that everyone should all pile on one thing and all be in solidarity and say the same stuff. That's not how I've seen things move in a political system. I think really it's helpful for people to, basically all saying, we need to solve climate change and we need to stop all this stuff. But what I think is helpful is to have distinct messages and distinct approaches that really are linked, to who you are. And I think that the people, decision makers, policy makers, and the public respond more strongly to that.
Thank you very much, Bruce. You've given us a lot to chew on. Sorry, it's the voice of God coming at you. It's me, Melissa. Again, I think we're bumping into the upper limit of our time here. But I wanted to offer a reflection on what you said. I really hear strongly the message that you're sending us, which is that authenticity is really important when we're speaking with decision makers on the public, and our strength is in health and the experiences that we have with our patients. But I guess one question that I have for you is, many of us now live and work in the communities that are directly affected by extractive industries, by polluting industries. And so it's not only a matter of what we're seeing in our own patients, but also a matter of what our wisdom is around where industry needs to go or not go in order to maintain health. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about particularly physicians like Dr. Augusto Horn, who lives and works in Akwesasne and sees the direct impacts of pollution on her community and her family, or Dr. Ulrika Meyer, who lives in Dawson Creek, who deals with the health effects of fracking in her practice and also feels like she has a moral obligation to oppose new fracking. Like, what are your thoughts about how physicians, particularly in those place-based situations, can advocate effectively?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there is a distinction, and this is one of the challenges with climate change and why I think it's been such a struggle to deal with it. In fact, in my book, I describe the important distinction between place-based work and global challenges. And if you're, in fact, I years and years ago, I was trying to convince the oil sands and pipeline campaigners that were very active in Alberta 10 years ago that their focus should, my view was that their focus should be on local health effects of the local population, including the Indigenous population, and specifically related to air and water quality, not surprisingly, and the effects of the emissions and the toxicity in the population directly. So in that case, absolutely, I think physicians can be community advocates, basically opposing, or suggesting alternatives. Because it's, again, you've got credibility. The credibility is still connected to the fact that you're in the community and you're seeing people and you understand. So I'm not suggesting, well, whatever you do, don't ever say anything bad about, fossil fuels or something. But it is, that's a very good, a really important distinction, Melissa.
Okay, I think we have room for some other questions. I don't know if we want to take one from Toronto. It sounded like Toronto was hopping in terms of questions they might want to ask. Anyone?
Hi, Samantha here, new president of keynote. Sorry about that. And also my husband, Peter Dietz, says hello, who I think you've worked with before. So I just wanted to address, there's this clear tension between your presentation and the previous presentation that I don't think you were here for. I think, many of us agree on the importance of leveraging our position as doctors and the privileged voice that we have as doctors, but we also have to address the root cause of pollution and the climate crisis, including, for example, pipelines and bad climate policy. Because we need to make those links for people. We need to make the link between the impact of wildfire smoke on asthma and fossil fuel infrastructure, because people are not making that link. That's the problem, right? So how can we help the public link the health outcomes that we're seeing in our practices and say the proposal to build a new pipeline? Even if you're taking the example of tobacco, doctors made that link for people. Doctors talked about the need for an ad ban on tobacco advertising. They talked about the need for systemic change to address the problem of smoking. So, how can we be just advocates and not activists, but also help people make the link between these health outcomes and what needs to change politically?
So I personally, I don't think you need to make the connection to pipelines. I don't think you personally, as a doctor, need to do that. That's my view. I think all kinds of people are doing that. There's entire organizations, and that's all they do. I think it dilutes your credibility as health professionals once you weigh into issues that are outside of your area of expertise. I mean, I realize this is not what everyone wants to hear. It's a challenge that we see across, I think, across a lot of issues. So, I mean, and part of it isn't, just, well, whatever you do, don't talk about it. But I think you're basically trying to convince someone, like say a federal minister, that they need to be doing something, and you can be meeting with them on, climate change policy broadly. But I think they just need to hear from you everything that you know about the health effects of all of the things that we're not doing right on climate change. And I don't know if you could say, I don't know. You could maybe just touch on it or say, for example, or we know that this is a problem, or why are you continuing to, propose that we build oil pipelines when we know that's problematic? You can sort of ask those questions, but I just don't, I just think really what they're going to find unique and interesting from you, because they're going to hear from every environmental activist that same message. It's not news, and then you're not giving them something where they're going, oh, wow, I hadn't like I never heard that before, or that's interesting. Now that a doctor says it, I should probably pay more attention. Like I just don't see that happening.
Thank you. We've got a question here from Tim DeCaro.
Hey, Bruce. Thanks very much for your talk and the book and all. I'm a physician scientist, and I stopped seeing patients a couple of years ago. My work has been largely on the health effects of climate change and the exceeding planetary boundaries. I'm terribly disappointed that our corporate media does not connect the dots for people, that they don't say that new fossil energy infrastructure will kill people in the future. And they refuse to make the connections that many of us do make. I mean, I spent a long time, 10 years, fighting the Trans Mountain Pipeline on strictly scientific basis, but the health impacts were not considered. And so it is in my job as a public health physician to make those links between new fossil energy infrastructure and how people die. So the question really is, how do we work both of these? The corporate media has abdicated their responsibility because they're part of the problem. In the case of the Globe and Mail, for example, it's a business paper, obviously, and they are very, very reticent to criticize any new fossil energy infrastructure. But they also refuse to make these connections. So how can we bring our expertise to that issue when we know that building new fossil energy infrastructure will kill people?
Yeah. No, I think the killing people part is a good message. We're, and it is, yeah, believe me, the media is a big problem in all of this, and mainstream media, social media polarization and disinformation. Like it is, I mean, we're up against something that is almost insurmountable, and it's getting worse. In fact, I would recommend all of you write a note to Stephen Guilbeault, who is now our Minister of Heritage, Culture, and something else, who is in charge of potentially reintroducing online harms legislation in Canada, which will deal both with things like online harms to children, as well as disinformation related to climate change. But anyway, that's another thing where Canada is sadly far behind the world. So, I mean, it's a very good question. I mean, people need to be connecting the dots at some level. And I think I just go back to the question that Melissa read out on particularly related to things in your own communities and things that are related to like specific place-based campaigns or direct things that you're seeing. But the challenge that we've had with climate change is that we've known for about this, literally for decades. In the last 10 years, I always use the example of the United States. In the last 10 years, the United States, which has more environmental activists per capita than anywhere in the world, more climate philanthropy than anywhere in the world, two, very sympathetic presidents in Biden and Obama. And over that tenure, they increased their oil production massively and to become the world's largest oil producer, and increased their LNG exports massively. And so I don't know I guess I've kind of lost faith in this idea that all we have to do is explain to people that this is a problem and someone is going to do something about it. The power and connection between the corporate elite, political elite, fossil fuel elite just seems to be sadly impenetrable. And part of my thinking, and having looked at what are all the major so-called climate successes in the world, very few of them had anything to do with climate change. They're related to energy security. They're related to economic development. They're related to, wind in Denmark, air quality in California, coal in Ontario. So for whatever reason, climate change has not been a motivator of action. So I'm just telling you what I've looked at, and I've been rethinking how we go about this. So I understand it may not be a very satisfactory response, but I've been in enough rooms with enough senior people to see how much they just dismiss this stuff, sadly.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. There's a real interesting diversity of opinion popping up in the chat. And I think in the conversations that we're having around this issue, I think something that people in the audience are trying to bring up is that health is a cross-cutting issue. It's like you almost cannot stay in your lane because so many different social and environmental, ecological determinants of health dictate what we see in our patients. So it's almost artificial to kind of try to keep ourselves only to what we're seeing. But there's a question here from David Rosen. He has his hand up.
Hi, thanks, Dr. Lourie. I'm kind of disappointed that today we haven't talked about the role of agriculture and food systems, because agriculture and food systems are responsible for about 25% of all greenhouse gases worldwide. And there's been no mention that the cow is really the elephant in the room here. The reliance on beef, we know in our practice, you mentioned clean air, clean water. Well, what about food? And food is, there are myriad of studies which have looked at the role of diet, that the causes of diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, cancers, a lot is related to our food systems. And that's what we deal with every day in our offices. So I'm kind of disappointed that has not been mentioned today and not been a prominent point of discussion. The Lancet has had many articles about this. We will never get a hold of climate change unless we deal with the cow, essentially.
Yeah. It's funny. We've as I mentioned, we got this group going, which isn't food directly, but farmers, trying to get them engaged. Similarly, having the idea that the Agriculture Canada doesn't really listen to environmentalists, but they sure do listen to farmers. So we've got them engaged. But the broader issue, I was at an event a few months ago, and it was in North American, so Canada, US, Mexico, people talking about regenerative agriculture and the future of food. And it really dawned on me, just to reinforce everything you're saying, that if I were running a food campaign, it would basically be called something like, first stop killing people. Like all of these companies, and all the big companies were there, McCain and Weston and Pepsi and all these companies. But you realize these multinational food companies and the additives and ultra high processed foods. I agree with you 100%. I don't understand, and it would be great. I don't know. Maybe that would be a fantastic campaign for physicians to really be leading, and it probably even worse in terms of human health going on right now in the world than the effects of climate change. So I agree. It's something that I don't quite understand how the multinational control of the agri-food industry and how so many people around the world are dying as a result of that isn't a topic of conversation. I can't explain that other than media control.
Yeah.
Multinational media control of the agenda would be my, I guess, conclusion.
Right. Good comments. Thank you, David. And thank you, Bruce. And David Suzuki made a comment in the chat that industrial agriculture is the problem. I think, I said to everyone that we'd end at 5 after the hour. Bruce, there's one more question from Leah Temper. I see she's got her hand up, and I'm wondering if we can entertain one more question before we end for the day. Is that okay with you? So many people want to learn from you and hear what you have to say. So there's no end of interested audience members here. Go ahead, Leah.
Thank you. Yeah, you've really kicked up a storm of debate. So thank you very much for being provocative. And I'm sure we're going to take this conversation forward and discuss it. My question is, so I know you mentioned the Online Harms Act and you said to write Stephen Guilbeault, and I wasn't sure if that you were saying to write in our individual capacity as activists or capacity as advocates, because we actually, I don't know if you're familiar, so we've had the Fossil Fuel Ads Make Us Sick campaign, which was focused on the health impacts, greenwashing campaign, which was also trying to draw those links between greenwashing and health, sometimes in, a bit of a longer, more circuitous route for people to understand. And now one of the new things we've been working on is disinformation. And, we've been reaching out to the government and showing how disinformation harms people in moments of extreme weather, for example, in public health emergencies. So some of the messaging we're doing is really towing that line, I would say. And similarly to work that we do when we talk about healthcare cost savings. So we wish that there was, think tanks and other groups that would do this work, but the problem is that nobody else is doing it. And if we're not sort of stepping up and making that case and being that health voice and rallying other health voices, nobody's going to be talking about the debate in those terms. And I think this also applies to some of the other issues around commercial determinants of health, cultural change, so on and so forth. So we try to be speaking about from the medical clinical perspective, but also trying to bring in some of these other issues and be the health voice in those conversations. And I'm curious a little bit on your take of how to best navigate in those spaces.
Yeah. So just to be clear, I am 100% supporting you being a health voice and a loud health voice and an active health voice and an engaged health voice. I'm being a little bit deliberately provocative just to get you all talking. You certainly need to figure out the connections that make sense. But what I'm really saying is lead with health. And I'm actually helping advise a foundation that's focused exclusively on children's mental health. And I'm helping them navigate the federal system around online harms and how online activities are harming children and children's mental health. And I know nothing about it, although I'm disgusted that Canada is so far behind the world in actually regulating social media. So my point was, I just talked to a couple of our ministers earlier in the week about this, and we are going to see some kind of legislation. It failed last year, or the end days of Trudeau, like a lot of things. But there is going to be the re-emergence of an Online Harms Act. Stephen Guilbeault is the minister responsible for it. I can connect you to the people who are directly involved. There's a whole campaign. There's a lot of organizations are involved. It's a big campaign. I don't know. I know there are children's health people and mental health people involved. But it is, I'm just suggesting that might be something that you look into, because it's active. It's about to come out, and having doctors' voices is going to be really important in that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. I think something that we can all agree on is that CAPE, we are at our strongest when we speak as physicians, when we relate stories from our communities, because that makes us the most authentic and most credible. And there's a diversity of opinion here about how to communicate. But I think something that CAPE always does is always uses that health frame to advance policy. So thank you so much, Bruce, for joining us. Thank you for all your support in so many ways, whether on our honorary board, whether it's financially through the Ivey Foundation or through sharing your wisdom with us today. And we hope you have a great rest of weekend. And that actually brings us to the end of today's events. I want to thank you again. It's been an incredible honor to be president for the last 3 years of CAPE. I'm not going anywhere far. I'm going to be president-elect for the next 2 years. But it's so heartening to be in this room with CAPE champions and staff and volunteers, and to be connected to all of you across the country who are doing this incredible work to protect the health of people on the planet. So thank you. I'll see some of you tomorrow, and let's all stay in touch.